I'm happy to be here. I'm Tesary Lin from Question. So what I'm going to talk about today is the choice architecture deployment that the companies often use when they try to collect the data from the consumers. And the focus today that I'm going to talk about is how this choice architecture is actually going to affect the representativeness of the sample that the companies are collecting. So this is what we call as kind of selection bias in the title. Now, based on the reaction in the room when Woody asked the question about, this design patterns, I get a sense that, well, most of you are already familiar with choice architecture. So basically, when we go to the websites, oftentimes we come across a consent banner that asks you, well, whether you are willing to share the cookies with the website and with the advertisers. Now here, examples of the choice architecture, well, they mark the accept cookies as a default, and they made the decision to opt out from sharing much more difficult compared to what you would have done if you just click accept. So this is quite familiar to us, and we also know that, well, oftentimes companies design their choice architecture, they try to optimize it with the goal to maximize the volume of the data that they collect. Now, this might sound natural to you, but it's actually very problematic. It's problematic not because not just because, well, they nudge consumers into sharing more data that they would like, but because this practice of focusing only on maximizing the volume that would often lead them into collecting the data that is more biased compared to what would have been happening otherwise. Now, why do we care about the bias in the input sample if we have the bias in kind of a biased data set that will often lead to a biased algorithm, and a biased algorithm that could often lead to biased decision making down the road? Back in 2018, Amazon developed an AI hiring tool. They eventually need to abandon them because it turns out that, well, this AI hiring tool was systematically biased against women. And one of the main reasons for that bias in the algorithm was because, well, when they try to train the data, there are very few female resumes in the training data. So here we see an example where the bias in the input data can often lead to biased algorithms and decisions. All right, so how exactly would different type of choice architectures affect the sample bias? In order to figure out that question, we ran an experiment. The experiment randomizes consumers into different choice architecture conditions. And then we basically try to measure if we ask them to share the data in different choice architectures, how many people would share? And also we want to figure out what is the composition of the consumers who decide to share the data. And then we characterize the trade-off between data volume maximization and balancing kind of, the representativeness. So what I want to show you today are two main findings in our paper. The first one is that, well, we find that there is a subset of the consumers who have lower baseline privacy valuations, so they are systematically more likely to share their data to begin with, but also they are more easily influenced by the choice architecture. So what that means is that, well, if there is a company that deploys a choice architecture, these consumers will actually be much more likely to share their data, whereas they are already kind of more likely to share the data to begin with. So that usually creates a trade-off between that creates a tension between this data maximization goals and the bias minimization goals for the data collectors. So the second finding that I want to show you is that, well, usually the choice architectures that maximize the sample volume opens up the potential for collecting a more biased sample. Now, I want to say this is not 100% always the case. We characterize the conditions in our paper. But here, what I want to highlight is that, well, if you see the trade-off, so suppose, well, if you look at the darker ones, the darker dots are representing what you would collect if you use a volume maximizing choice architecture, whereas the lighter ones are what you would get from a bias minimizing, for example. So the trade-off is usually larger if you're a company that have a lower baseline consent rate. So that would usually more likely to happen if you are, for example, a startup that don't have a lot of consumers willing to share your data to begin with, or you have a policy or a platform-wide change that basically kind of moves the company down to a lower baseline consent rate. In those cases, the trade-off would usually be larger. And then another thing before I wrap up is that, well, if you look at the lines here, the lines are mostly flat. So what does that mean? What that means is that, well, if you're a company, your starting point is the volume maximizing choice architecture, you will actually be able to sacrifice your volume for data just a tiny bit, to move to a regime where you actually kind of get a much more representative data with just a tiny bit of the volume reduction. Okay, so that's all from me, and the details is on my website with the PDF. So feel free to check it out if you're interested.